In the spring of 2007, Charleston County officials believed they were conducting a routine survey of abandoned plantation land scheduled for rezoning. What they uncovered instead would force the quiet reopening of court records sealed since 1850 and revive the name of a woman who had been deliberately erased from Southern history. Inside a collapsed slave cabin on what was once considered one of South Carolina's most elegant estates, investigators discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, it was a leather-wrapped archive, fragile, mold-stained, and written in a hand that no enslaved woman was ever supposed to possess. The name signed on the final page was Delphine, and what she recorded inside that cabin was never meant to survive. Before anyone ever pried up the floorboards of that collapsed cabin in 2007, before county officials realized they were standing on top of something deliberately hidden, Delphine already existed as a problem that South Carolina's plantation world did not know how to solve. She entered the Whitmore-adjacent estate system in the late 1840s, a period when Charleston's wealthiest families were obsessed with refinement, reputation, and the illusion of moral order. Plantation records from that era rarely lingered on the appearance of enslaved women unless beauty itself became a logistical concern, something to be managed like surplus grain or unruly livestock. Delphine's file did not read like a standard inventory entry. Her description was longer, revised more often, and annotated in margins by different hands. Words like composed, unusual bearing, and too noticeable appear in documents meant to track labor, not personality. From the beginning, her presence disrupted routines. Overseers noted that visiting guests asked about her without knowing her name. Household mistresses complained that Delphine's assignment to interior duties caused unnecessary attention. Ministers dining at the estate reportedly paused mid-conversation when she entered the room, not out of impropriety but discomfort, the kind that arises when a social hierarchy briefly fails to function as expected. Beauty in an enslaved woman was not admired, it was treated as a liability, because it drew attention to contradictions the system depended on ignoring. Delphine was assigned her own cabin earlier than most women her age, and notably closer to the main house. Officially, this was explained as convenience. Unofficially, proximity allowed surveillance. The closer she was, the less likely she was to develop a private life beyond observation. Yet this closeness produced an unintended consequence. Delphine was present when decisions were made. She carried trays into rooms where men discussed land purchases, debt settlements, and legal disputes. She stood against walls while contracts were debated, wills adjusted, and punishments rationalized. No one lowered their voice. No one paused. Enslaved women were trained to be invisible, and Delphine mastered that role so completely that people forgot invisibility did not mean absence. Over time, patterns emerged, names repeated across conversations, grievances that never reached court, disputes resolved with money rather than law. Delphine absorbed this information without comment, without reaction, without ever signaling that it mattered to her. That restraint would later prove to be her greatest protection. What unsettled the plantation's hierarchy was not merely that Delphine was noticed, but that she could not be easily categorized. She was neither submissive nor defiant, neither flirtatious nor withdrawn. She did her work with precision and silence, which paradoxically made her harder to control. Overseers relied on predictability, fear, exhaustion, desperation. Delphine offered none of those cues. Punishments did not change her demeanor, privileges did not soften her. By 1849, plantation correspondence begins to reference her indirectly, not by name, but by implicat. The girl assigned near the house, the one who draws attention, the woman who hears too much. That last phrase appears once, crossed out, rewritten as requires discretion. Even then, someone recognized the danger of naming the real concern. It was never that Delphine spoke. It was that she listened. Her cabin reflected this contradiction. From the outside it appeared unremarkable, even neglected. The boards were weathered, the roof uneven, the hearth crudely constructed. But inside, the space was meticulously maintained. Nothing was out of place. No personal effects were displayed. It was a room designed not for comfort, but for control, of self, of environment, of attention. Later analysis would reveal subtle modifications to the structure, floorboards shaved just enough to lift silently, stones in the hearth arranged to conceal rather than support. These changes were not rushed. They were deliberate, incremental, executed over years. Delphine was not planning an escape. She was preparing for something else entirely. By 1850, rumors about her had begun to circulate quietly among white households connected through marriage, commerce, and shared legal interests. She was described as too observant, unsettling, unnaturally calm. These were not accusations that could be acted upon. There was no rule against awareness, so instead the system did what it always did when faced with an unmanageable variable. It watched, it waited, and it reassigned. Delphine was moved between households, lent out for domestic service, returned again, always close enough to monitor, never far enough to lose track of. Each relocation expanded her exposure. Each new environment offered more information. The very mechanism designed to contain her inadvertently sharpened her understanding of how power actually operated. What no one seemed to grasp was that Delphine had already begun to document what she observed, not in a way that resembled rebellion, but in a way that resembled accounting. Names, dates, locations, relationships. She did not editorialize. She did not moralize. She recorded. That choice is critical to understanding why her archive survived at all. Opinion invites refutation. Emotion invites dismissal. Facts, arranged patiently, become something else entirely. They become a threat. By the time Charleston's elite families entered 1850, a year marked by legal anxiety, economic strain, and growing fear of exposure, Delphine was no longer simply an enslaved woman whose beauty caused discomfort. She was an unacknowledged witness to a system that depended on secrecy as much as violence. And before we go any further into what she would uncover, what she would preserve beneath that cabin floor, and why her name was nearly erased from history altogether, I need to pause and ask you something directly. If stories like this matter to you, stories history tried to bury because the truth was too dangerous, then subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next, and leave a comment telling me how gripping you find this story so far. Because what Delphine was about to do did not just endanger her life, it threatened to expose the fragile machinery behind South Carolina's most powerful families, and once you understand that, there is no turning back. By the time Delphine had been moved through her third household assignment, the plantation system had already made a quiet but critical mistake. It had mistaken her silence for emptiness. In Charleston's elite homes, silence was expected from enslaved women, but it was never respected. It was interpreted as absence of thought, absence of memory, absence of capacity. That assumption allowed Delphine to occupy spaces where information pooled freely, unguarded by caution. She served breakfasts where newspapers lay open on tables, their columns filled with shipping schedules, court notices, and coded announcements of financial distress. She cleared dinners where men argued over land boundaries and debt obligations, their voices sharpened by wine and familiarity. She stood behind chairs during late-night conversations when the day's civility had worn thin and truth slipped out, not as confession, but as complaint. Each household believed it was merely borrowing her labor. None realized they were lending her their secrets. What made Delphine's education especially dangerous was that it did not resemble education at all. No one taught her to read formally. No one placed a book in her hands and instructed her in letters. Instead, she learned the way people have always learned when survival demanded it, through repetition, pattern recognition, and necessity. Legal phrases repeated themselves across documents. Names appeared again and again in different contexts. The same men who toasted charity at church dinners appeared in whispered disputes over missing funds. Delphine began to associate handwriting styles with voices, seals with outcomes, signatures with consequences. Literacy, for her, was not about language alone. It was about structure. She learned what documents did in the world, how they moved power, how they erased responsibility, how they made violence administrative. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when someone noticed. A clerk once paused after seeing Delphine return a folded document to its precise place, oriented correctly, the seal unbroken. A mistress remarked that Delphine seemed to understand instructions before they were finished. These observations never matured into suspicion because acknowledging them would have required confronting an uncomfortable possibility that an enslaved woman was mentally navigating the same systems that were meant to exclude her. Instead, these moments were smoothed over with reassurances. She was observant. She was quick, compliments that reassured the speaker while obscuring the truth. Delphine accepted them without reaction. She had already learned that recognition was more dangerous than ignorance. It was during this period that Delphine began to test memory against reality. She noticed discrepancies between what was said publicly and what was resolved privately. A dispute announced as settled in court lingered in conversation weeks later. A death recorded as accidental was followed by sudden changes in inheritance. An enslaved man hired out to a neighboring property disappeared from discussion entirely, while a payment appeared in an unrelated ledger. These inconsistencies were not dramatic on their own. Taken together, they formed a map, a quiet outline of how Charleston's power brokers protected themselves. Delphine did not need to know the law to understand its function. She only needed to see who benefited when it was invoked and who vanished when it was not. Her first written records were not ambitious. They were fragments, names scratched onto scraps, dates marked with charcoal, locations noted in shorthand that would have meant nothing to anyone else. She hid these early notes poorly at first, tucked into seams and cracks, learning through small losses what could be discovered and what could not. When a scrap went missing, she changed methods. When a hiding place was disturbed, she abandoned it entirely. This process was slow, cautious, and deeply intentional. Delphine was not acting out of urgency. She was building endurance. The archive that would one day be found beneath her cabin did not emerge fully formed. It grew the way roots grow, quietly, invisibly, responding to pressure rather than plan. The system around her continued to misread her movements. When she was transferred again in late 1849, this time to a townhouse closer to Charleston proper, the decision was framed as a reward for reliability. In truth, it was a response to discomfort. Someone had noticed that Delphine had been present in too many sensitive moments. Rather than restrict her, they relocated her, assuming that distance would dilute whatever she had absorbed. Instead, the city sharpened her understanding. Charleston was denser, louder, more interconnected. Information moved faster there, carried by gossip, by notices nailed to posts, by hurried conversations in hallways. Delphine learned how quickly reputations could be reshaped and how easily inconvenient truths could be drowned beneath spectacle. In these urban households, Delphine encountered something new: paper handled carelessly, letters left half-written, drafts discarded in waste bins, notes scribbled and forgotten. Plantation life had trained men to guard their documents because land and labor depended on them. In the city, confidence bred sloppiness. Delphine capitalized on this without ever appearing to do so. She memorized letterheads. She learned which seals mattered and which were ornamental. She learned which names commanded silence and which invited scrutiny. And slowly she began to copy, not verbatim but selectively. She did not need every word. She needed connections. The brilliance of Delphine's method lay in its restraint. She never wrote while observed. She never carried more than she could destroy quickly. She never recorded emotion. Her notes read like inventories, not accusations. This was not accidental. She understood instinctively that emotion could be dismissed as resentment, but inventories demanded response. By stripping events of feeling, she forced them to stand on their own. A payment recorded without explanation invited questions. A repeated name demanded context. Delphine was constructing a structure that could survive her absence. As 1850 approached, Charleston's elite families grew increasingly anxious, though few could articulate why. The year carried legal and political weight, new debates over federal authority, growing scrutiny from outside the South, and whispered fears of internal exposure. Power structures do not collapse suddenly, they tighten. Rules become stricter, surveillance increases. Delphine felt this tightening immediately. Conversations became more guarded, doors closed more often, assignments shifted without explanation. Yet even this served her purpose. Restriction clarified priorities. The information that became harder to access was the information that mattered most. By the time Delphine was returned to her cabin near the plantation, a move framed as consolidation of labor, she was no longer simply observing. She was organizing. The cabin that once represented surveillance became a workspace. Floorboards were adjusted incrementally. Stones were repositioned. Oilcloth was acquired and hidden. Each modification was small enough to escape notice, justified as maintenance or accident. The archive began to take shape not as a collection of secrets, but as a system of reference. Names cross-checked against dates. Locations matched to outcomes. Silence noted where explanation should have existed. What no one realized was that Delphine's greatest protection was the very thing they feared least: time. She was not rushing toward exposure. She was preparing for inevitability. Systems built on secrecy eventually produce more secrets than they can contain. Delphine understood this intuitively. She did not need to force collapse. She only needed to preserve evidence until the moment arrived when it could no longer be ignored. And so, as 1850 settled over South Carolina with its familiar rituals and hidden tensions, Delphine returned to her cabin, not diminished by displacement, but fortified by it. She had learned how information moved, how it was hidden, and how it could be made to survive. The woman they believed they had contained was now something else entirely, a living archive in progress. And in the next phase of this story, that archive would begin to record not just patterns of power, but death, events too final, too violent, and too carefully erased to remain invisible forever. By the time Delphine began documenting death, she had already learned the most dangerous lesson the plantation world could teach her, that violence was rarely sudden and almost never loud. It arrived quietly, disguised as misfortune, as negligence, as inevitability. The first death she recorded did not announce itself as murder. It was spoken of casually, almost lazily, the way people refer to an inconvenience that has resolved itself. An enslaved man named Elias, hired out to assist with river transport along the Ashley, failed to return one evening. By morning, his absence had already been explained for him. He had been drinking, he had slipped, the river had taken him, there was no body retrieved, no inquest requested, no pause in operations. The river, everyone agreed, was dangerous. Delphine heard this explanation repeated so consistently that it began to feel rehearsed, as if the words themselves had been agreed upon before the event had even occurred. What caught her attention was not the drowning itself, but the way Elias's name vanished immediately afterward. He was not reassigned, he was not referenced as a loss. His absence created no disruption in labor schedules. Instead, there were quiet adjustments. An additional worker sent to the docks, a payment logged under a vague description, a tense conversation between two men who normally avoided one another. Delphine noticed that Elias's name appeared in her memory alongside those men, connected by nothing more than proximity and timing. She did not yet know what that connection meant, but she wrote the names down anyway. She had learned by then that understanding could come later. Recording had to come first. In the weeks that followed, Delphine paid close attention to how deaths were discussed. Some were mourned performatively, their stories repeated with dramatic flair, warnings embedded about obedience or fate. Others were mentioned only once, if at all, before being swallowed by routine. It was this second category that concerned her. These were the deaths that left no residue, no sermons, no reprimands, no lingering caution. They passed through the system as if anticipated. Delphine began to notice that such deaths often followed moments of tension, arguments overheard, questions asked too openly, mistakes witnessed by the wrong people. Cause and effect were never acknowledged, but the sequence was unmistakable. Her records from this period grow denser, more deliberate. Dates become more precise. Locations are noted relative to landmarks rather than vague descriptions. She begins to mark who was present before a death and who benefited afterward. This was not speculation, it was accounting. The plantation economy trained everyone within it to understand value, loss, and replacement. Delphine applied that same logic to human lives, not because she believed people were commodities, but because the system did. By using its own language, She ensured that what she recorded could not be easily dismissed as sentiment or superstition. The second death she documented was described as illness. A woman from a neighboring property, known to Delphine only through shared labor routes, fell suddenly and violently ill after returning from a service assignment inside a Charleston home. She died within days. The explanation offered was exhaustion, poor constitution, the weakness of her sex. Delphine remembered that woman differently, alert, careful, known for keeping her head down. What unsettled Delphine was not the illness, but the speed with which the woman's few belongings were removed and her sleeping space reassigned. There was no period of uncertainty, no waiting to see if recovery was possible. The machinery of replacement moved too quickly. Delphine wrote down the name of the household she had last served, then crossed it with the name she already had. One appeared again. As her list grew, Delphine realized she was documenting not random cruelty, but maintenance. These deaths were not spectacles meant to intimidate, they were corrections, quiet removals of variables that introduced risk. Someone who overheard too much, someone who spoke carelessly, someone whose presence complicated arrangements that relied on discretion. The plantation world liked to imagine itself as chaotic, ruled by impulse and brutality, but Delphine saw something else entirely. She saw order, cold, methodical, and deeply invested in preserving itself. This realization changed the way she listened. She no longer focused only on what was said, but on what followed. A disagreement at dinner preceded a disappearance weeks later. A legal threat mentioned in passing was resolved without court, followed by an unexplained death on an adjacent property. Delphine began to recognize that the same handful of names clustered around these events, moving through them like fixed points, while others orbited briefly before vanishing. These men did not raise their voices, they did not issue threats. Their power lay in their ability to make problems stop existing. Recording this information became more dangerous with every entry. Delphine adjusted her behavior accordingly. She became more forgettable, not less. She slowed her movements. She avoided eye contact. She made small, deliberate mistakes to reinforce assumptions about her limitations. She learned when to appear confused and when to appear absent. This was not submission, it was camouflage. Every moment of underestimation bought her time. The archive beneath her cabin began to take on a new character during this phase. It was no longer just names and dates. It included sequences, event, conversation, disappearance, adjustment. Delphine used symbols of her own creation to mark certainty versus suspicion. She left space between entries, anticipating additions. She was building something meant to be navigated, not simply read. If she did not survive, someone else would need to understand what she had seen without knowing her personally. What made this work especially perilous was that Delphine had no illusion of protection. She was not collecting evidence to present to authorities. She understood better than anyone that the same system producing these deaths controlled the law meant to investigate them. Courts were not neutral spaces, they were extensions of the same social network. If these truths surfaced prematurely, they would not bring justice, they would bring retaliation. Delphine's task then was not exposure, it was preservation. By late 1850, the deaths she recorded began to cluster more tightly. The intervals between them shortened. The explanations grew thinner. It was as if something had shifted among the powerful families she observed, an unspoken urgency that made them less patient. Delphine sensed that someone suspected a leak, even if they did not know its source. Conversations became clipped. Documents were locked away more carefully. Assignments were altered without warning. She felt the perimeter closing in. And yet, even now, no one suspected her directly. That was the final irony. The woman closest to the truth remained the least imaginable threat. The system had trained itself too well to see her as anything other than labor. That blindness allowed Delphine to complete the most dangerous phase of her work, documenting deaths not as tragedies, but as evidence of intent. As winter approached, Delphine made a subtle but decisive change. She stopped recording new names immediately. Instead, she revisited old entries, cross-referencing, reorganizing, clarifying. This was not retreat. It was consolidation. She understood that accumulation alone was not enough. Meaning had to be unmistakable. Patterns had to survive scrutiny. If this archive was ever found, it would need to speak for itself in a language the powerful could not easily silence, because by then, Delphine knew something else as well. The deaths she was recording were not ending. They were escalating, and the closer she came to the center of that pattern, the more likely it became that her own name would eventually belong on the list she had so carefully constructed. By the time Delphine began transforming her cabin from a place of containment into a place of concealment, she was no longer reacting to danger. She was anticipating it. The realization that her own name could one day belong among the dead she had documented did not arrive as panic, but as clarity. Panic wastes time. Clarity sharpens it. She understood now that what she was building could not rely on her continued presence. Whatever survived would need to exist independently of her body, her voice, her memory. That understanding changed everything about how she moved through the world and how she treated the space she had been assigned to inhabit. The cabin, once merely a symbol of surveillance and isolation, became something else entirely, a vault disguised as neglect, a structure whose ordinariness was its greatest protection. From the outside, nothing changed. The cabin remained weather-beaten, its boards warped by humidity, its roof patched unevenly with salvaged materials. Overseers saw decay and assumed apathy. They did not recognize intention, because intention in an enslaved woman was something they refused to imagine. Inside, however, Delphine worked with a patience that bordered on surgical. She altered nothing quickly. Every modification was incremental, spaced out over months, justified by wear, by accident, by necessity. A floorboard loosened here, another shaved thin there. Stones in the hearth rearranged not all at once, but one at a time, so no single inspection would reveal change. She learned the sound each board made when stepped on, adjusted pressure points, memorized which movements could be concealed beneath routine. The cabin became a physical extension of her discipline, silent, controlled, unassuming. The archive itself evolved alongside the space. What had once been scraps and fragments now demanded order. Delphine grouped entries not by time alone, but by proximity of names, by recurrence of locations, by the pattern of benefits that followed each death. She used oilcloth scavenged from discarded packaging to protect pages from moisture, wrapping them carefully, stacking them in sequences that made sense only if one understood how to read for absence as much as presence. She was not writing a story, she was assembling proof. The distinction mattered. Stories invite interpretation. Proof demands response. Delphine wanted the latter, even if she would never live to see it. What is most unsettling about this phase of her work is how deliberately she resisted the temptation to overreach. There were moments, undoubtedly, when she knew more than she wrote. Names she could have included but didn't, suspicions she chose not to record. This restraint was not fear, it was strategy. She understood that accuracy was her only defense against dismissal. One false connection, one unprovable claim, could allow the entire archive to be labeled unreliable. So she wrote only what could be traced, what could be cross-checked, what left footprints in ledgers and schedules and payments. In doing so, she held herself to a higher standard of evidence than the courts that would have ignored her. As the cabin took on its new function, Delphine's behavior outside it grew more carefully calibrated. She withdrew socially in ways that appeared natural, even desirable. She volunteered less. She avoided spaces where conversations grew heated. She made herself smaller, not physically, but perceptually. This withdrawal had a secondary effect. People stopped associating her with information entirely. She became background again, which was exactly what she needed. The less she appeared to know, the less anyone questioned what she might be doing when unobserved. Invisibility, once imposed, became chosen. Yet even in this withdrawal, Delphine could not fully escape the gravity of what she had documented. The deaths continued. If anything, they grew more efficient. Explanations shortened, transitions smoothed. The system she was observing was learning too, adapting to pressure it could feel but not locate. This adaptation only reinforced Delphine's resolve. She was no longer recording a static pattern. She was watching evolution, and evolution leaves traces no matter how carefully it tries to erase them. It was during this period that Delphine made her most consequential decision to stop carrying information on her person entirely. Until then, she had relied on memory when necessary, trusting that her discipline would protect her. Now, memory became a liability. Interrogation, illness, injury, any of these could strip her of control. The cabin, therefore, had to hold everything. Once an entry was finalized and stored beneath the floor, Delphine did not revisit it unless consolidation demanded it. She trained herself to let go, to trust the structure she had built rather than her own recollection. This was an act of profound self-erasure, undertaken deliberately. She was ensuring that the archive would not die with her. What no one noticed was how this self-erasure changed the way others treated her. She was no longer considered interesting or unsettling. She became forgettable. Overseers stopped commenting on her presence. Household mistresses redirected their anxieties elsewhere. This shift was not accidental. Delphine had learned that curiosity was dangerous. Boredom was safety. By making herself unremarkable, she insulated the remarkable work happening beneath her feet. The irony is difficult to ignore. The cabin, intended as a means of control, became the one place Delphine exercised autonomy. Within its confines, she decided what mattered, what would survive, and what would be allowed to disappear. In a world that denied her ownership of her own body, she claimed ownership of information, and information, unlike flesh, could outlast punishment. As months passed, the archive reached a kind of completion, not an end, but a stability. New entries became rare, not because deaths had ceased, but because the pattern no longer required constant updating. The structure was clear, the names were sufficient. Delphine shifted her focus to preservation rather than accumulation. She tested hiding mechanisms, introduced redundancies, adjusted placements to account for moisture and decay. She was thinking not in years, but in decades, perhaps longer. She had no illusions about when the archive would be found. She only knew that it should be. By the end of that year, Delphine had fully transformed her cabin into something that defied its intended purpose. It was no longer merely a place where an enslaved woman slept under watchful eyes. It was a sealed room in waiting, designed to survive neglect, abandonment, even destruction. A place where truth could remain dormant until the world outside it changed enough to hear it. And as Delphine moved quietly through her days, increasingly unnoticed, increasingly alone, she understood that the most dangerous thing she had done was not documenting death. It was refusing to let the system decide what would be remembered, because once memory is secured beyond reach, power loses one of its most effective weapons, and Delphine had just taken that weapon away. By the time Delphine understood that power had begun to sense her existence, not her actions, not her archive, but the disturbance her presence created, she also understood that power rarely confronts what it cannot name. Instead, it circles, it probes, it applies pressure in places it believes will force a reaction. And it was during this phase, when pressure replaced certainty, that the men whose names appeared most frequently in her records began to behave differently. Their confidence, once effortless, grew brittle. Conversations shortened. Hospitality became performative. The plantation system, so adept at projecting stability, revealed its unease through overcorrection. Delphine noticed that decisions were now justified aloud, not assumed. Men explained themselves when no explanation was required. That alone told her everything she needed to know. Someone suspected that information was moving beyond its intended boundaries, even if they could not yet identify how. The first attempt to locate the leak came disguised as concern. Delphine was summoned, not accused, merely questioned, about routine matters that had never previously required her input. Had she seen unfamiliar faces near the cabins? Had anyone been speaking out of turn? Had she noticed unrest among the workers? The questions were carefully framed to sound protective rather than probing. She answered simply, minimally, offering nothing that could be contradicted later. She understood the nature of these inquiries immediately. They were not seeking answers, they were observing her responses. They were measuring hesitation, tone, eye contact. Delphine gave them nothing. Her calm was not defiance, it was discipline. When that approach failed to produce results, the pressure shifted. Delphine's assignments were altered without explanation. She was moved again, this time under the guise of labor reorganization. The distance between her and the cabin increased, not enough to arouse suspicion, but enough to inconvenience her access. This was not random. Someone believed that proximity to her living space mattered. Delphine adapted without visible resistance. She adjusted her schedule, altered her routines, and returned to the cabin only when absence would not be noticed. Each visit became more deliberate. each action more final. She had already prepared for this possibility. The archive did not require constant maintenance anymore, it only required survival. The men who sensed a disturbance began to test each other as well. Delphine noticed fractures forming among them, subtle but significant. Payments once coordinated quietly now required negotiation. Trust, once implicit, became conditional. The system that had thrived on shared silence began to strain under its own weight. This was the unintended consequence of secrecy. It binds only as long as everyone believes it is intact. Once doubt enters, it corrodes from within. Delphine did not cause this doubt. She merely preserved the evidence that made it inevitable. It was during this period that an attempt was made on the cabin itself. The event was recorded as an accident, a small fire, quickly extinguished, attributed to a faulty hearth. No investigation followed. The damage was superficial, almost symbolic. The floorboards remained intact. The stones concealing the archive were untouched. To Delphine, the message was unmistakable. Someone was testing the boundaries of destruction, gauging how much could be erased without consequence. It was a warning, not a search. They were telling her, or whoever they believed responsible, that erasure was an option. Delphine responded not with panic, but with withdrawal. She ceased visiting the cabin altogether for a time, allowing the incident to pass without visible concern. This restraint likely saved her life. Power expects reaction, fear, protest, explanation. When none arrived, the narrative collapsed back into uncertainty. The cabin returned to being what it appeared to be, a decaying structure housing an unremarkable woman. The fire became a footnote. The threat receded, temporarily, yet Delphine understood that this reprieve was not permanent. The system she was observing had reached a dangerous stage. It was no longer simply maintaining itself, it was searching for internal threats. And internal threats, once suspected, are rarely tolerated for long. The men whose names dominated her archive began to behave more cautiously, but also more decisively. Problems were resolved faster, witnesses disappeared sooner, the margin for error narrowed. Delphine recognized this acceleration for what it was, preparation. At the same time, she noticed something else. Something quieter, but equally telling. There were moments when those same men hesitated around her, not fear exactly, but awareness, as if some instinct warned them that she was closer to the truth than she should be, even if they could not articulate why. This awareness manifested in small ways. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Documents were gathered more quickly. Instructions were repeated unnecessarily. None of this constituted accusation, it was recognition without acknowledgement. And recognition, Delphine knew, was the most dangerous stage of all. She responded by making herself smaller still. She avoided enclosed spaces. She volunteered for labor that kept her outdoors, visible, predictable. She limited her exposure to private conversations. In doing so, she starved suspicion of fuel. The less she appeared to know, the harder it was to justify concern. This was not retreat, it was misdirection. Every moment she remained alive without incident increased the likelihood that the archive would outlast her. It is important to understand that Delphine did not romanticize this phase of her life. There was no sense of triumph in watching power turn on itself. The cost was isolation. The discipline required to maintain invisibility demanded emotional erasure. She could trust no one. She could share nothing. The archive beneath her cabin represented not hope, but burden. She carried the knowledge that if discovered, it would not protect her, it would condemn her. And yet she continued, not because she believed in justice, but because she believed in record. Someone, someday, would need to know that what happened was not accidental. As the months passed, Delphine noticed a subtle shift in how her existence was discussed. Less frequently, more abstractly. She was no longer referenced as an individual, but as a category, that woman, the one near the cabins, the domestic assigned there. This linguistic distancing was deliberate. Dehumanization simplifies decision-making. When people become categories, consequences become easier to rationalize. Delphine recognized this shift immediately. It told her that her presence had moved from inconvenience to consideration. She prepared accordingly. The archive was sealed for the final time. Redundancies were checked. The floorboards were returned to their most inconspicuous arrangement. Nothing remained in her possession that could link her directly to what lay beneath the cabin. She committed no final words to paper, no explanation, no appeal. She understood that the power of what she had created lay precisely in its lack of commentary. The documents would speak in the language their creators respected most: transaction, pattern, outcome. What followed was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no arrest, no recorded punishment. Delphine simply began to fade from the system's active awareness. Assignments ceased, her name appeared less frequently in ledgers. She was not sold, she was not transferred, she was not listed among the dead. She became something else entirely, unresolved, and unresolved variables are intolerable to systems that demand control. By the end of this phase, Delphine understood that her survival was no longer the point. The archive was complete enough to fulfill its purpose. Whether she lived or disappeared, it would remain dormant, waiting. The men who sensed her presence never realized how thoroughly she had already succeeded. They searched for a threat they could confront, punish, erase. They never considered that the most dangerous act had already occurred, not in defiance, not in exposure, but in quiet preservation. Because once evidence exists beyond reach, power loses its ability to rewrite reality completely, and Delphine, standing at the edge of her own erasure, had ensured that no matter what happened next, the truth would remain, patient, silent, and impossible to fully destroy. After Delphine faded into that unsettling state of being neither present nor gone, the plantation itself began to change in ways that no ledger could adequately explain. Systems built on domination depend on predictability, and Delphine's unresolved existence introduced a fracture that could not be neatly categorized. She was no longer useful enough to track closely, yet not insignificant enough to dismiss entirely. This ambiguity created a quiet tension that spread through the Whitmore operation like damp rot through timber. Overseers adjusted routines without clear rationale, records grew inconsistent, tasks were reassigned, then reassigned again, as if the plantation were unconsciously compensating for a missing variable it could sense but not identify. Delphine watched all of this from within the system, unseen precisely because she had become ordinary again, and in that ordinariness she gained a new kind of freedom, the freedom of being underestimated. What she understood, more clearly than ever, was that power does not fear morality, it fears exposure that it cannot control. The men who ran Whitmore and the neighboring estates had survived accusations before. They had navigated scandal, violence, and rumor with practiced ease. What unsettled them now was not the idea that crimes had been committed, but the possibility that those crimes had been catalogued beyond their influence. Delphine sensed this fear in the way visitors arrived unannounced and left dissatisfied, in the way private conversations were held farther from windows, in the way correspondence was burned rather than stored. Evidence was becoming something to destroy reflexively, not selectively. That instinct told her she had succeeded more thoroughly than she had ever intended. At the same time, the human cost of her strategy pressed heavily upon her. In order to survive, she had learned to erase herself emotionally, to suppress visible intelligence, to respond with compliant dullness. This erasure was not without consequence. The isolation it required hollowed her days, stripped meaning from interactions, and forced her to endure indignities silently, even when she possessed knowledge that could unravel the men responsible. But Delphine had already accepted a truth that many never do. Resistance does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like endurance so disciplined that the system forgets you are resisting at all. As months passed, rumors began circulating, not about Delphine directly, but about inexplicable misfortune among the planter class. Deals collapsed unexpectedly. Trusted associates betrayed one another over minor disputes. A suspicious drowning along the tidal creek was dismissed too quickly, raising more questions than it silenced. These incidents were not directly connected, but Delphine recognized the pattern immediately. When systems lose internal trust, they begin consuming themselves. Each man feared that another might know more than he did, might possess proof, might preemptively betray him. The unity that once protected them dissolved into cautious self-interest. Delphine's archive played no active role in these events. It remained hidden, untouched, but its mere existence had altered the psychological landscape. Power, when confronted with the possibility of permanent record, becomes erratic. Decisions grow reactive. Violence escalates not out of necessity, but out of anxiety, and anxiety, unlike strategy, leaves traces. Delphine watched as enslaved people who had once been ignored were suddenly relocated without explanation, as cabins were dismantled and rebuilt farther from common paths, as conversations about containment replaced earlier language of order. These were not reforms, they were defensive maneuvers. During this period, Delphine herself became the subject of subtle erasure. Her workload diminished without explanation. She was assigned tasks that required little interaction and even less oversight. No one openly threatened her. No one accused her. Instead, she was SL, hourly being rendered irrelevant, a fate often reserved for those power cannot safely eliminate without consequence. This invisibility was both protection and warning. It meant she was no longer seen as useful, but not yet safe to remove. She existed in a narrow margin that required constant awareness. She understood then that her life, like the archive, had become provisional. She did not know whether she would survive the year or whether an accident would eventually resolve the discomfort her presence caused. What steadied her was the knowledge that the archive no longer depended on her. It had achieved autonomy. Even if she vanished, it would remain beneath the cabin, sealed against time, waiting for a future that would not need her name to understand its significance. That future, though distant, was already taking shape in small, unintended ways. A clerk dismissed for incompetence carried with him vague recollections of inconsistencies. A visiting attorney noted irregularities in plantation records that did not align with reported yields. A young physician questioned discrepancies in mortality reports. None of these individuals knew Delphine. None suspected the existence of an archive. But each encountered fragments of truth that no longer aligned with the official narrative. Delphine had not exposed anything directly, yet she had destabilized the foundation upon which falsehood depended. The emotional toll of this prolonged tension was immense. Delphine lived with the constant awareness that discovery would not be dramatic. It would be sudden, efficient, and final. There would be no trial, no explanation, no opportunity to defend herself. That knowledge sharpened her senses and hardened her resolve. She slept lightly. She observed relentlessly. She trusted no kindness that came without motive. Survival became an act of quiet calculation rather than hope, and yet, despite everything, she did not regret what she had done. The archive was not created out of vengeance, nor even justice in the conventional sense. It was created because lies thrive in the absence of memory. Delphine believed that memory, documented, preserved, undeniable, was the one force capable of outlasting power. Even if she never lived to see its impact, she had ensured that the narrative of Whitmore and those like it could never be entirely controlled again. As this phase of her life drew toward its uncertain conclusion, Delphine sensed that the system was approaching a breaking point. Not collapse, but transformation. The pressure she had helped generate would not dismantle it immediately, but it would force adaptation, concession, and eventually exposure. History rarely turns on singular acts, it turns on accumulation, and Delphine's contribution, invisible and unacknowledged, had become part of that accumulating weight. She remained where she was, quiet, watchful, unresolved, knowing that the most dangerous stories are not the ones shouted aloud, but the ones buried carefully, waiting for the moment when the ground above them can no longer hold. As the invisible pressure continued to build, Delphine reached a stage of awareness that few ever survive long enough to understand. The moment when a system begins preparing for after you. It is not marked by confrontation or accusation, but by subtle rearrangements meant to ensure continuity once you are gone. She sensed it first in the way her name stopped appearing in spoken exchanges altogether. Tasks were assigned around her, not to her. Decisions were made as though her presence were already hypothetical, a variable being phased out. This was not neglect, it was rehearsal. The plantation was learning how to function without her, and that realization carried a weight more chilling than open hostility ever could. Delphine adjusted accordingly. She reduced her movements further, syncing her routines with predictable rhythms so perfectly that deviation itself would draw attention. She became part of the background machinery, as reliable and unremarkable as the creak of the dock or the tide's slow pull through the marsh channels. At the same time, her internal vigilance intensified. She listened not for what was said, but for what had stopped being said. When men no longer complained openly, when punishments became quieter but more final, when explanations disappeared entirely, she knew the plantation had entered a phase of containment rather than correction. Containment does not seek solutions. It seeks silence. It was during this phase that Delphine realized something even more unsettling. She was no longer the only risk. The archive had altered behavior beyond Whitmore. Other plantations in the Low Country began mirroring the same patterns: sudden destruction of records, reassignment of laborers without documentation, deaths attributed to vague causes and buried quickly. Information had not traveled, but fear had. The idea that someone, somewhere, might be keeping track had spread like an infection. Power structures, when threatened abstractly, respond collectively. Delphine had unknowingly triggered a regional paranoia. This paranoia, however, carried consequences the powerful could not fully control. Increased secrecy created inefficiency. Rushed decisions produced errors. The effort to erase traces left new traces behind, burn marks where books had been destroyed, gaps in accounting that raised questions rather than closing them. Outsiders noticed. Officials sent inquiries. Clerks whispered. The very act of hiding became visible. Delphine, watching all of this from her shrinking corner of existence, understood the irony with painful clarity. The system was unraveling itself in an attempt to remain intact, her own life narrowed to essentials. She conserved energy, avoided conflict, and prepared mentally for disappearance. Not escape. She knew better than to imagine freedom, but erasure. She did not know whether it would come as illness, accident, or reassignment to a place from which no one returned. What she did know was that fear no longer controlled her. She had crossed beyond it into something colder and steadier, acceptance paired with purpose. If her removal was inevitable, then her responsibility was to ensure that removal added nothing to the system's sense of closure. One evening, as the heat lingered long after sunset, Delphine returned to her cabin and stood still for a long time, listening. The sounds were familiar: the insects, the distant water, the muffled movement of others settling into exhausted sleep. She knelt and lifted a single floorboard, not to add or remove anything, but to confirm what she already knew. The archive was intact, dry, stable, complete. She replaced the board carefully and sat back against the wall, allowing herself, for the first time in years, to feel something close to relief. That night, she made a decision that would define the final shape of her resistance. She would leave no personal marker, no name, no signature, nothing that would frame the archive as an act of an individual rather than a record of reality. If discovered, it would not point to her, it would point outward toward those whose actions filled its pages. This anonymity was not self-denial, it was protection for the truth itself. The story would not hinge on her survival or credibility, it would stand alone. In the weeks that followed, Delphine noticed increased activity near her cabin. Not inspections, those would have been too obvious, but casual pass-bys, pauses, glances that lingered half a second too long. Someone was reassessing the space. She responded by doing nothing. No changes, no reactions. She understood that any attempt to secure the archive further would itself become evidence of something worth securing. Sometimes preservation requires restraint more than action. Then, without warning, the attention shifted away. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The watchers moved on. The routines normalized. Delphine remained. This reprieve did not comfort her. It unsettled her. Systems rarely abandon scrutiny without reason. More likely they had concluded that whatever threat existed was no longer active. That assumption, she knew, was dangerous, but not for her. What Delphine could not know was that years later, long after her cabin had been abandoned, long after Whitmore itself had decayed into quiet ruin, others would step into that space carrying questions rather than orders. They would not be looking for a person. They would be looking for answers. And when they lifted the floorboards and uncovered what had been hidden with such care, they would feel the same chill Delphine had felt when she first realized the scale of what surrounded her, the chill of understanding that evil is rarely chaotic. It is organized, documented, and protected, until someone refuses to let it forget itself. As Delphine moved through the remainder of her days, unresolved and unacknowledged, she carried one certainty with her like a steady pulse. The system believed it had outlasted her. It was wrong, because long after her body would be gone, long after her name would be erased, the truth she had sealed beneath that cabin would remain, waiting patiently for the moment when silence could no longer contain it. What finally happened to Delphine is something history never recorded, and that absence is not an accident. It is the final proof of how completely the system believed it had succeeded. There was no entry marking her death, no notation of sale or transfer, no report of illness or escape. One season she existed, folded into the machinery of Whitmore like a forgotten cog, and the next she did not. To the plantation, this was resolution enough. People vanished all the time. Silence was not suspicious, it was expected. And so Delphine passed out of living memory the same way countless others had, unmourned, uncounted, unacknowledged. But what the plantation did not understand was that her disappearance did not end the story. It completed it. Years passed. Whitmore Plantation declined, as all such places eventually did. The soil tired, the profits thinned. Ownership fractured through inheritance and debt. Buildings fell into disrepair, then into abandonment. The cabin where Delphine had lived became just another collapsing structure, avoided not out of reverence but inconvenience. Nature began its slow reclamation. Wood swelled and cracked. Vines threaded through broken slats. The ground settled and shifted, pressing down on what had been hidden beneath it, not to destroy it, but to seal it more firmly in place. Time, the great eraser of suffering, became instead her accomplice. When the land was finally surveyed generations later, long after slavery had been abolished, and long after the families who once ruled the Low Country had rebranded themselves as respectable pillars of history, the cabin was no longer remarkable. It was debris. And debris, ironically, is often treated with more honesty than monuments. There was no reason to protect it, no incentive to preserve appearances. That is how truth survives, not when it is guarded, but when it is forgotten just enough to be overlooked. The discovery itself was unceremonious, a structural assessment, a rotted floor giving way, a worker noticing something that did not belong, oilcloth where there should have been dirt, careful stacking where there should have been chaos. When the bundles were lifted and unwrapped, when the pages were exposed to light for the first time in over a century, the reaction was not immediate understanding but confusion. Names appeared repeatedly, dates aligned too neatly, causes of death echoed official records but contradicted them in subtle, devastating ways. This was not folklore, it was not rumor, it was documentation. What followed was discomfort, then resistance. Attempts were made to contextualize, to minimize, to frame the archive as incomplete or biased. But the very absence of a known author undermined those efforts. There was no individual to discredit, no motive to assign. The archive did not accuse, it presented. It did not argue, it recorded. And in doing so, it forced a confrontation with a version of history that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or myth. Delphine's greatest act of defiance, it turned out, was her refusal to center herself. By erasing her own identity from the record, she denied future generations the comfort of a singular villain or hero. There was no catharsis in her story, only implication. The focus remained where she had always intended it to be, on the system, on the patterns, on the quiet coordination of cruelty carried out by respectable men who had trusted that time would absolve them. It did not. The archive changed nothing immediately. Truth rarely does. But it changed something more enduring. It disrupted the narrative of inevitability. It proved that even within the most controlled environments, even under conditions designed to strip people of agency and voice, observation could become resistance, memory could become weaponized, and silence, when used deliberately, could outlast force. Delphine did not live to see any of this. She never knew whether her work would be found, whether it would matter, whether it would survive the weight of years pressing down on it. But that uncertainty was never a weakness. It was the point. She acted not because success was guaranteed, but because forgetting was unacceptable. In a world built on erasure, she chose preservation. In a system that depended on disposable lives, she created something indelible. And that is why this story still unsettles us. Not because of what was discovered inside that cabin, but because of what it reveals about power, memory, and the dangerous assumption that the past stays buried. Delphine did not overthrow the system. She outlasted it. She proved that even when voices are silenced, records can speak, and when they do, they speak with a clarity that time cannot soften. If this story stayed with you, if it made you uncomfortable, reflective, or quietly angry, then you understand exactly why it matters. Stories like this were not meant to survive. They were meant to rot along with the cabins, the names, the lives reduced to footnotes. The fact that this one didn't is no accident. It is a warning. So before you go, subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss the stories history tried to erase, and leave a comment telling me how deeply this story affected you. Because the more we remember, the harder it becomes for the truth to be buried again.